Hi folks, today I'm working on my Ruins mod and I've started to build out some more proofs of concept to make sure that things work the way they should. I have my little OneNote here which kind of outlines the proofs of concept that I want to do, and the one I'm working on right now is visual reduction in the ruins until they're completely removed. So the idea here is that workers come and disassemble the ruin. They need to start from the top, so visually they need to take the top of the ruin off first and work their way down. And as they're removing pieces from the ruin, they need to be able to collect stuff and bring it back to their workplace, which is the salvage yard. So I've been busy working on the code and a simple prototype 3D model for this. So foundation mods are basically text files. So I use Visual Studio Code, which is a free tool from Microsoft. It's a very lightweight development environment that you can use to edit any kind of file, really, any kind of text file that is. And I've chosen to use it because it's pretty simple. You can use plugins to add the Lua syntax checkers, so it tells you if you have a Lua error on your page. And I also have some other tools that help me kind of, keep the code clean, and you can see it kind of color codes everything. So what did I do for this prototype? So number one, I created some components. Now components are a little bit advanced for modding. At least they're advanced for me. When I first started modding, I didn't use components at all. I just accessed the Foundation API through sort of what I would call the standard assets. So this is the Foundation API. You can see it's online, and it lists out all the different things like buildings and building parts and functions and jobs, everything that you can access in the modding API, which is pretty extensive. Foundation actually has a pretty good API considering that it's a custom engine that was built by the devs, and it can't take advantage of all the built-in modding capabilities that you might get, say, if you were working on a game that was developed in Unity. So what I've done is I'm creating my own component called comp ruin. So this is a component that gets attached to the ruin itself. Say it's a tower, so each tower ruin will have one of these components. And within the component, it keeps track of whether it's been initialized and a list of the pieces in the ruin. So this is just a list of strings, a list of, text. Each time a ruin is created, which will only really happen once at the beginning when the mod is first loaded onto a game, it makes a list of all the pieces within itself. So I'm envisioning that, every type of ruin will have a different set of pieces. And the pieces, if you look in Blender here, I've started a prototype model for a ruin. This is just a stack of blocks, obviously, so it's nothing fancy, but it helps me prove that my concept will work. So I've got a stack of blocks, and these blocks are called pieces, right? So each one says piece 1, piece 2, piece 3, and piece 10 is the one on top. So the worker is going to start disassembling the ruin from the top, from the last piece in terms of alphabetical order. I also have these other points that I'm calling gather points. So they're around the edge of the ruin. And I mentioned this before that I need to allow the workers to gather the pieces, but they can't go inside the ruin to do that because there's a building zone around this ruin to prevent people from walking inside it. And vanilla gathering behaviors will only work if the gathering point is outside that. So what I decided to do was I would just set up gathering points outside of the building zone, and these would have the resource that the worker was looking for. So this is what they're actually coming to collect. They would come, they would collect this resource, and it would disappear. And when this is destroyed, when this gathering point is destroyed, it will trigger some code that will remove the next block in the sequence. And that way, no matter which gathering point the worker goes to, each one of them will use the same code to remove the blocks in order. So if there's 4 workers all disassembling the castle at one time, it will still only remove the blocks in exactly the right order, regardless of which gathering points are selected by the worker. The 10 gathering points don't correspond to any one block. They all trigger the same code to remove these 10 pieces in order. Here's a ruin in the game, and I'm going to go ahead and place a village center. And I've got a prototype salvage yard, which is just, again, I don't spend any time on modeling until I'm sure that the concept will work. So these are just simple cubes. I've got 4 paths inside the salvage yard, and when I build that, it has 4 different workers. So I'm going to assign workers, and they're going to go to work, and they're going to go collect the salvage. So you'll notice that all 4 workers go to different places around the ruin. Now, I'm not sure, I need to maybe work on their behavior so that they'll actually face the ruin. I suppose it doesn't matter too much. But they should all pick a different site, so they'll never pick the same site, because as soon as they reserve that site, the behavior will say no one else can reserve it. So as soon as the first person stops chopping, the top block will get removed, and then the next one, and then so on and so forth. So you can see the blocks being removed in order. And they should keep going until all the blocks are removed in the order that I created them. And they should also start working on the next one. So you'll see them going over here and removing blocks from this ruin. Okay. So from a proof of concept, that seems like it's going to work fine. I'll have to tweak where they stand in relation to the ruin and some different things like that, but I think it's going to work out great. All right, next up on my list, and the last proof of concept before I can start actually making the 3D models, is removal of the building zone once the object is removed. So let's go back into our model here. If I go down to where the ruin is actually defined, it's here. So I'm registering what's called a prefab, which is just a copy of an object, and I'm giving it certain attributes. So I'm giving it a building zone, and the building zone that I'm giving it right now is a circle with a radius of 2.1 meters. In the game, people are about 1.8 meters tall, so 2.1 meters is like, 2.5 villagers laid end to end. And I grab a building of any kind. I should see a building zone around the ruins. And yes, I can see one when I hover over it, but it's not big enough. So I'm going to go ahead and make it bigger. So I'll make the radius 4, save that and reload the game. And then from a proof of concept perspective, I just need to check that the building zone is removed as soon as the entire ruin is removed. So here I am again. I've got the ruin here. It's got the right building zone around it. I'm going to use this building workshop to make sure that when the entire thing is removed, the building zone is removed as well. I actually don't think this is going to work without some custom code, but we're going to find out. Yeah, so you can see that the building zone is still there. So even though they've cleared all the pieces, the object itself, even though its children objects, so to speak, are gone, the object itself is still there. So I need to add some code to basically remove the object itself once all of its children are removed. So that should be easy. I go back to my code. I already have some code that works on destroying the pieces when they are removed. So what I can do is I can check and see if it's the last object, if there's only one left when it's being destroyed, I can go ahead and destroy the parent itself. So I'm in here. I've just destroyed the sub object, which is the piece. And now I just check and say if self piece list comp ruin piece list, and I'm going to count those, so I put a number sign in front, equals less than 1, then self, so then we go comp ruin get owner destroy. So comp ruin is the ruin component. It's attached to the entire ruin. Get owner just gets the object that's associated with that component, and then I can destroy it. So go ahead and start gathering, and we're just going to double check with our building hut to see what happens when the last one is removed. Okay, so it worked. The last one was removed, and now there's no building zones anymore. So the entire object itself has now been deleted completely from the map, which is great because that's also less overhead for the game to keep track of objects that aren't needed anymore. One thing that I often do if I'm breaking new ground like this and doing something I'm not sure is allowed, let's say, is I'll reload the game after this happens. So yep, it worked the second time. I'll Control-Shift-R to reload. Occasionally, when you're doing something that the developers didn't expect you to do, the game will crash or it'll have weird behavior when you get back in. So I'm going to go back in here and just double check that those 2 building zones are still gone, and they are. Super. And I'm going to check my log. So there's a log file that's generated with Foundation. I'm just going to scroll through this and double check at the end of that last game that there's no issues. It seems like there's no issues here. Okay, so we have finished the proof of concept. So now we know that we can spawn an object with the building zone. We can salvage things from the ruin. We can visually reduce the ruins as they're being salvaged. And when they're finished being salvaged, they disappear entirely and the building zone is removed. We're now confident that we can build this mod the way that we've envisioned it. So let's get started with the first 3D model. Okay, before I make a real model, I wanted to show some things that I do in Blender, which are sort of standard things you have to do when you're working with Foundation. Some of these are outlined in guides that exist on mod.io, so I don't have to go through everything in detail, but I will say that there's a couple things that I do in Blender. One is when you're grouping stuff in Blender for Foundation, you can only use 2 levels that I'm aware of. It has to do with when you export this model to the file format that Foundation requires, it will only use 2 levels of the hierarchy. So I'm in here, I have my collection of stuff, and I've got basically a parent object and then the children underneath it. And that's as low as I can go in my hierarchy. I can't make super complicated hierarchies. So what you end up doing is you say, okay, here's one part. So for instance, I have my salvage yard, which is the parent part, and you put the word part in the object name. That's important because Foundation will attach certain other things to this object when it imports it into the game. So if you have the word part in it, that will help when we use that object in the game. So I have the parent part, which is just an empty node in Blender. So I'll show you how to do that. So if I were to create a new part, I would go to add. I'm in layout mode, by the way. I go add, empty, plain axes. And I can say this is my parent part. And I like to use numbers, even if I only plan on building one salvage yard, for example. I'll still use numbers because someday I'll come back and want to build a second salvage yard, and it's just easier if you have numbers on the end of all your objects so that you can create more of them. So that's a parent part. It's an empty axis, and if you hit Control period, you'll see that it has direction, so it's facing a particular direction. In Foundation, I often think of direction as being the x-axis, so that's the direction that it's facing, and you can see the x-axis up here. That's basically front in all of my models, and when you're doing attachments and stuff, you have to keep track of which direction your objects are facing. But I'm going to turn that off and Control period. Then you would add an object, so a mesh. So for instance, here's a cube, and then you shift and drag that cube into the parent. So now you've got a cube that belongs to parent part 1. So parent part 1 is what you're going to register when you go back to Foundation, and cube is just a thing within that. I'm going to go ahead and delete that. That was just an example of how I set this up. The ruin itself, so I mentioned I have, the gathering points, which are empty axes around the center, and you can see that they have a direction as well. I'm hoping that the villager will use that direction when they gather the resource, although that didn't seem to be happening when in my testing earlier, but I'll see if I can fix that. I'm going to hide those, and then I have the blocks, which are just the physical, visual aspects of the ruin, and those are all just cubes. They're meshes inside. So if I were to, let's say, adjust this, so let's, maybe shrink some blocks down, move them around a bit. So we'll just make that small adjustment there. We'll move this one over here. And I'm going to select everything by hitting A, and then I hit Control A. And before you import stuff into Foundation, it's useful to apply rotations, and then Control A again, and apply scale. And you want to make sure you do that only on meshes. You don't want to do it on any kind of axis, because that will reset the direction of the axis. But Foundation seems to like it when you reset this so that the object itself is always facing the same direction. So you can see all these objects face X. They're all facing the X direction now instead of being turned somehow from the main axis. So I've saved that, and I'm going to export. So I go to File, Export, and the file type that Foundation uses is called FBX. So we'll go to FBX, and there's a couple settings you need when you're using Foundation. You have to set this forward transform to X, and you have to apply transform here. Check that box. So I'm going to export it to my working directory, and then I go to my mod. So this is Windows Explorer, and I've got my Ruins mod. I have a folder called Models. You don't have to put your models in a folder called Models, but that's just how I organize it. So I've got my models there, and I'm going to go back to the FBX file that I just exported, and copy that and overwrite the model in there. You don't have to do anything with this meta file. That will regenerate automatically when you go into the game. And I'm going to refresh, so Control Shift R, now all the ruins should reflect that new physical model. So you can see that this box has gotten smaller and moved, and this one has moved over, so it's reflecting the changes that I made. So that's just in a nutshell how you get stuff from Blender into the game. Obviously there's the code behind this that registers everything, but there's lots of examples of how to do this from existing mods. Like if you go into any mod, you'll see that it sets up a building, and then it sets up a building part, and you'll see how it registers the thing from the FBX file, and it registers as a prefab, and then it attaches that prefab to the building part. So I'm not going to go through that in huge detail because that's just basic stuff that you're going to have to learn as you look at existing mods and try to come up with your own. I did some work in Blender, and you can see here I've got some ruins that I've built. What I basically did is I started with a tall tower, a round tower, and I started chipping away at the tower. This is the tall version that I did. I started with this model, and then I basically started cutting out pieces to make the model smaller as people reduce the bulk of the tower. So you can kind of see over time the tower gets smaller as they reduce from the top. So they're disassembling the tower. Obviously in real life they probably have some scaffolding or something, but I'm just going to go for a simple approach for the moment, and then they reduce it down to the point where the tower is just a stump of stone. And I've also got in here, I've got a bunch of stones that kind of add to the ambiance. They're not actually used by the salvage worker, but they add to the sort of feeling that this is a ruin. And around the edges of the tower, I have my gathering points. So these are outside the building zone, and these are the ones that are accessed by the gatherers. And when they're destroyed and gathered, it removes one piece off the castle tower. At the moment, the manager script, which is generating the ruins, is just generating a single ruin at a specific point on the map. And it's rotating the ruin a little bit and scaling it randomly. But other than that, it's just placing the ruin once. Then I have my ruin code, which is doing quite a bit. The first bit of the code is attaching to the ruin itself, so the entire ruin, and this is setting up some important things at the beginning. So when the ruin is first placed, it looks for the gathering points, and it adds a component to those gathering points that will be used in a second. It looks for all the pieces, which are the individual visuals that are shown as each piece is gathered. And it records those pieces in a table, which is then accessed later. And it looks for all the stones, and it sets those to grounded. So meaning if the ruin is placed on uneven terrain, each stone will be grounded to the ground instead of floating or being below the ground. I sort the list of ruin pieces alphabetically. So if you go back to Blender, you can see that they're piece 1, piece 2, piece 3, and so on. So however I've set these up in Blender, it will sort them alphabetically in the list. It's actually descending order, so that it'll start with the largest piece, the tallest piece, so to speak. And that's the piece that'll get removed first. So whenever a worker destroys a gatherable, so when they gather something, they destroy the point. When they do that on destroy, I basically delete the first piece in the list. So if the tallest piece is the first piece in the list, which it is, each time a gatherable is removed, it deletes a piece in the list. And actually, all of the pieces are visible at one time. So in the game, you'll see that it looks like there's one piece being shown, but actually all the pieces are being shown. And just the newest, the largest ones are being removed first, which makes it appear that the tower is getting smaller. So that's that code. And then I have the code for actually creating this stuff in the game. So I'm in the game here, and I've got my ruin spawned and a little town center set up. So this is what the ruin looks like. First thing that I'll do is I'll create my test salvage yard. So this is the salvage yard, and then I'm going to go ahead and add some workers. And you'll see the workers go off and they go to the ruin. They go to the nearest gatherable that the game indicates they should use, and then they start to work. And when they work, they start to reduce down the size of the tower. Now, obviously, this will be much slower when I finish, but from a prototype perspective, this is how it's going to work. So they kind of take chunks out of the tower, and until hopefully, if it works correctly, the tower is completely removed. Okay, I'm back in Blender, and we've got piece 12. So what we're going to do is, rather than trying to, remove the pieces by hand, we're going to create an object. Start with a cube. And we're going to use the cube to remove the pieces from the tower. Oops. So, you know, I can basically set the cube so that anything within the cube is cut off from the tower. Obviously, I want it to be a little more complex than that. So what I might do is I'll go ahead and create a circle since we have a circle tower. So mesh, circle, make that bigger with S and scaling. And I'll go ahead and fill that in. Now, if you're here to get Blender tips, this isn't going to be a great source for them because I don't have time or the inclination really to repeat all the tutorials that I use to learn Blender. If you're interested in Blender tips, I highly recommend Infenzia on YouTube. He's a great YouTuber. He has sort of a nice low poly style which fits Foundation's style quite well. So I learned a lot from him. I learned a lot from various different tutorials. But what I'll do here is I will make this sort of around the same size. Let's go individual origins, around the same size as the tower. And I'm going to kind of create this sense that there are different pieces. So we'll go here, go here, select the edge loops. So we're going to kind of leave a little bit of a tilt so that it looks like they're gathering from the outside of the tower. Get that edge loop there. Shrink that in a bit. Okay, so now I've got these segments as well. So what I can do is I can sort of select some of them and extend them down. And what this will help is it'll create kind of the sense that the wall is being removed in courses, right? Create a little bit of variation here by raising them while they're attached. Okay, so I've created sort of this rough, but not quite so random variation. I'm going to go ahead and hide this so that I can easily work on my little cutout piece here. And I'm going to just go to transparent mode so that I can join some of these vertices along together. So I'll right click merge at center to make sure that those are together so I don't get any jaggedness when I go to cut this out. Alright, so go out of transparent mode so we can kind of see what we're dealing with. Yep, so I have this nice, you can see I might have a double line there, so I'm going to select all vertices. I'm going to go to merge vertices by distance, and this basically will combine any vertices that are really close together to eliminate double lines and things like that. So you can see now I don't have that double line that I had before. Alright, so we should be good now to use this as a cutout. Maybe I'll just adjust a few of these slightly manually. Get a little bit of a smoother action on these edges. I don't want them to be quite so distinct. So back to the castle itself. So piece 13, I believe it was called, piece 12. Okay, so you can see the original castle in there. So I'm going to just save my model and select that. I'm going to go into the modifiers tab. I'm going to go Boolean. So you can do a difference intersection. So this basically will cut out anything that intersects with this object. I'll Control A to apply that modifier. If I hide this now, I should see castle has this sort of look. That's piece 12. Then I dupe piece 12, rename it to piece 11. I go on down. So I'll hide this. And what we'll do is we'll rotate this. Z-axis, go down a little bit. Do the same thing again. Much cleaner now. Excellent. That one's got a bit of jaggedness there. About 2 or 3 or 4. Last one. So I had a bit of an issue with my random rotation script, which I finally fixed, and I've refactored some of the code, and hopefully everything's working now. So a change that I made in the code was, instead of displaying all of the objects at once and then deleting one at a time until only one was left, I am displaying only one object at a time. So right now you're only seeing one prefab, and then as soon as that one is deleted, next one is spawned and rotated in the same position. So you're only seeing one prefab at a time, which means that as the building is reduced, you're not going to get any of that shimmer where you have multiple prefabs, multiple objects overlapping each other. Looks like it's working quite well. Taking slow bites, quick bites out of the building. And we're just going to double check that everything goes down to 0. So I think everything is working. So we have our first ruin being correctly removed in pieces. We've optimized it so that only one piece is shown at a time. And when the last piece is removed, the entire ruin is removed. So I think we can use this template now to build the next ruin. And at some point we can also start working on the salvage yard to build that model. I've been working on the code to spawn the objects in the correct place, so avoiding water, avoiding steep slopes, and also avoiding placing a ruin too close to a building part or too close to another ruin. So I reused some code that I had created for the security mod, and basically this function looks for a position that is a minimum distance away from other ruins and buildings and at a maximum slope. I also have the water elevation set so that it has to be at least 2.5 meters above the water in order to spawn correctly, and that's in a sort of circle, so I'm checking 4 different points around the middle of the ruin to make sure that all of them are away from the water. So using that code, I'm generating 25 as the minimum distance from another object and 0.5 as the slope, so basically half of a 45-degree angle to 22.5 degrees. And when I run that on this map, for example, I get this. So I've just added a lot of castle ruins just to illustrate how the spawn logic is working. So you can see, for instance, that the castles only spawn on land. They only spawn on flattish places. So even here, the slope is too steep for them to spawn. Presumably this area here was a little bit too steep because it was trying to spawn along the edges, and nothing is spawning anywhere where it's too steep to access, which is great. I'll just test it with a relatively flat map. One of my maps is called Aylesmere, and we can just check how it looks there because it's very flat, so it shouldn't be spawning in most of the islands on this map because they're too low. Yeah, so we see that we have only the sort of higher sections are getting the ruins. Okay, for my next ruin model, I am taking a rustic church rework mod that I made quite some time ago, and I'm going to repurpose that church for the ruin, so it's going to be a ruined church. So I've got the base church here, and I'm going to basically be working this down to a ruin. So first thing I always check for when I start a new model is to make sure that I have plenty of basement. For a slope, you want to make sure that there's enough building below ground so that the building will appear correctly. Usually 5 meters or so is a very safe distance. I'm not spawning ruins on super steep slopes, but the church is bigger, so there's more opportunity for there to be a gap underneath if it spawns on a slope. So I've got 5 meters here. Maybe I'll go down to 5.5. I've got plenty of room. The building as it stands today, it has a stone roof underneath the original tile roof, so I need to edit that and remove that. I'm going to go ahead and select these, and I'm going to I for inset, I believe. And I'll get me there, and then I can E, pushing that down. Just going to actually push that down and get me my, go to transparent mode, get me my wall going down. So now I have the inner wall. Now I can delete those faces just to match it to the existing size of the texture. And then I'll do the same on the side walls. And using my perspective view, project from view, scale 7, S7. Now I've got sidewalls as well. So now we have a full kind of 3D wall, which we can then eat away. Start working on some cutouts. So let's just get ourselves a simple cube. Call it cutout 2. Scale that. Inch. Subdivide. Go ahead and move some of these edges down. Kind of a stepped look. And a little bit bigger. So we'll go ahead and we'll keep this base as a backup. So we'll go ahead and move that out. Search, backup. Hide it. Replace these windows with some cubes. And we'll give it a bit of an arch. So instead of the window, I'll hide those for a second. We'll give it a bit of an arch here. Selecting the 2 edges and subdivide twice, 3 times. So now we get our arch put on. This is called proportional editing, so it'll kind of drag. Use the mouse scroll wheel, it'll kind of drag the entire thing up. Give us a little bit of an arched window there. A little smaller, a little taller. Just right there. Okay, so let's put the windows back and then duplicate this model. Delete the windows. Instead of the windows, we'll use these. Going. Apply scale. I'm going to do a modifier. I always suggest applying scale first. Okay, so now we have our cutouts for the windows. Okay, so we've got a good church and we can start to chew it off basically with this. So we'll do a Boolean difference. There, we've got a nice straight edge. So now we've got a nice gap in the wall, which looks pretty authentic. To recap our progress so far, we have 2 ruins made, a tower and a church. We've completely finished the church model, so I've got all of the edges done, which is, again, the probably most time-consuming, annoying part of the job. I did some beveling. We've got the stones around the church, and I've also fixed up all the code and fully tested all the code of removing the ruins. Now I'm just testing one visual effect, which is that when I spawn the ruins, I will spawn it at different levels of decay. So in order to make it look like there's multiple different churches which aren't exactly the same model, I have this one, which is the full model. So this is like the highest ruin. And then if you look around the map, you might find another church that is in a different state of decay. So it looks like a different model and just gives that bit more variety. So if I have 4 or 5 church ruins around the map, it won't all look the same. Thanks for joining me today as I worked on my tower and church and also fixed up a lot of the behind the scenes code. So I'm very happy with the progress we're making so far. The best is that from now on, most of the code is finished and the way that I make the ruins is pretty set. So now I just need to make more models. I'm looking forward to that. I'm thinking about making a manor house, a castle, which would be a combination of the tower with some walls, some old stone wall boundaries, maybe a Roman Colosseum and a forum. I've done the church, a graveyard, huts, an orchard. And I'm also thinking that it would be nice if I could come up with some logic to spawn these ruins in groups. So maybe a small town or a village where multiple ruins are juxtaposed to make it look like it was an old town. I think that'd be really cool to have a couple of old settlements on the map when you start the game, just to give you a sense of place and a sense that there were people there before you. So thanks very much. Join me next time as I work more in Blender.